Hi, I'm Jeff, this is Tropical Plants at 53 degrees north, and today's video is all about watering. I'm going to share with you some of the hints and tips that I've learned from my experience, and we're going to look at watering orchids, pot plants, anything in peat or multi-purpose compost, things that you would normally think of as being house plants. We'll look at some mounts, we'll look at trying to water plants in those ornamental pots with no drainage holes, and I'll share with you some of the things that I've learnt along the way. Let's get started. And we're in. So I'm going to start with underwatering, and I think what I'll probably do is jump around from one thing to another. I'm not just going to talk about orchids. I'll just talk about we'll just call them I know they're all potted plants, but I'm going to kind of differentiate between plants that are in pots that have a multi-purpose compost or peat, and we'll differentiate that between orchids and that. So what we're looking at here is a Streptocarpus, obviously, just about to come into flower. The easiest thing to discuss first is underwatering. I think this is probably something that few people do on a regular basis. I think most people can kind of figure out whether a plant needs some water or not. And the easiest thing to think of course, is wilted leaves. So this particular plant was watered yesterday, but it's been in the sun all afternoon, and I've got to know and got to feel I think the scientific word is how turgid the leaves are, how rigid they are, and I can tell already that this is beginning to flop. They're not quite as turgid as they should be. And turgid means that they've got water in them, they're hydrated. So this, I know it was watered yesterday, and when I feel at the top there, it's as dry as a bone. Now that is only one indication. You can't really go off what it's like on top. Unless you've got some good experience with that plant. The weight of the plant, getting to know how heavy it is. Clearly if it's very, very light, then you know you've got a problem. So that was fine yesterday. Today it's been in the sun. I know it's a little bit floppy there, so I know that's going to need a water. A final check is to feel the top. I know that needs some water. So that's the first thing with Streptocarpus, certainly. Just moving on over, and we know we looked at this the other day, but moving on over to the bougainvillea, I wanted to point this one out because you can see that little hole there. I'll explain that in a second, but this, for all the world, you would say is as dry as a bone and needs to be watered. However, and this is my moisture meter here that we talked about the other day, if I just stick that in that hole there, we can see very clearly, there we go, that it's moist enough. It doesn't need any more water. Okay, so the first little tip is to have a feel of the leaves, if it's got any leaves. This case it hasn't, but if it's got some leaves, have a feel of the leaves, see how rigid they are. If they think they are wilting a little bit, if you can tell that they've obviously been in the sun, it's not a cloudy day, then have a little feel on the top, have a feel of the weight. What do you think? With all those factors together, that should tell you whether you think it needs watering or not. If there's no leaves on it, then a moisture meter is always a great idea. I can't use a moisture meter on this because it's so filled, or it's filled the pot so much that it's solid, it won't go into the pot. So the moisture meter is great for a lot of situations, but not all. We're over here on the hippeastrum, and these are another one that look really, really dry on top, but when I stick my moisture meter in, I can see that it's still moist, so I'm going to leave that one a little bit longer. These of course are bulbs, so that means that they've got a lot of what they need in the bulb as it is anyway, so you could probably leave those a little bit more. You can see they are beginning to get to the dry side, but I'm going to wait until that's completely dry before I water it. Okay, so that's underwatering of pot plants. So let's move over to the pelargoniums. Same kind of thing. I'll get to feel what the leaves are like. Oh, that one's coming away there. If I know that these are normally more turgid than this, then that gives me an indication. Another is the weight. This particular one is very, very, very light. And another indication is the petals. Now these particular petals, I've got to know that those I know are going over, so that's why they are flopped. However, let's just walk this way. Okay, so we're over here looking at the Thunbergia brownie. So this is the Thunbergia brownie. This one, it's all kind of mingled in with the mandorella there. But what I notice with this is that I can't pick it up because it's all kind of tangled and entwined. So I can't tell by having a feel of the pot whether it needs watering or not. I began to notice that these petals, and they're beginning to do it now, were kind of getting a bit floppy and look like they look like they needed some water. Now I would then, the only other thing open to me is to feel into the pot. No, feels dry as a bone. Yeah, it does. It needs some water. I would then go and water it. That was it. As far as I was concerned, it was done. However, when I got my moisture meter and stuck my moisture meter in there, and this is something that you've really got to be careful with a pot that has multi-purpose compost or peat in it, you know, the kind of fine compost. What happens is when they get very, very dry, they shrink away from the side of the pot. So you then go and water them, think it's had a water, the water just runs down the side where it's shrunk away into wherever your runoff area is, and you think it's done. And of course it might get a little bit, but that certainly won't be enough to hydrate the plant. And this is exactly what was happening to this, and it was only after getting the moisture meter that I realised what was going on. So what I've done there is I've put a little tray at the bottom there to collect the water, so that when I do water it, it runs down the side. It fills up a little reservoir there. Now you've got to be careful here. If this is something that you're going to go away and leave, and you're going to leave it for days on end, then that's not going to work, because what's going to happen is you are going to drown the roots of the plant. The plant's roots still need to breathe. In my case, I only put that on yesterday, and if I water that again now that I know I've managed to actually hydrate the whole of the pot, then I will leave that on when I water it, and then a couple of hours later I'll take it away. I'll let any excess drain away and run off. So that's a little tip. If you've got this kind of a pot that you can't pick it up, you can't look at it really closely, then it could be that it's shrinking away from the side. So that's something to look out for. If we've got orchids and we're talking about underwatering orchids, well, orchids are a little bit easy to check for underwatering. I'm used to temperate plants, and temperate plants are a lot more forgiving than orchids are. If you think where orchids grow in the wild, in the forests, even though they might be wet all the time, they do have that constant air movement. Now in a greenhouse or in a house they don't get that, and of course they're in a completely artificial environment when they're in a pot, and they're all kind of constrained. So if you imagine yourself standing in a greenhouse as opposed to standing outside, it's completely different. The whole atmosphere is completely different. Well, it's the same for the roots inside a pot. The whole atmosphere is completely different. So you can see I've put air holes around there to improve the drainage. The reason, or one of the main reasons, that we put orchids in transparent pots is so that we can see what's going on. Now you can see here that it looks very dry. It's probably ready for another water. Phalaenopsis in particular, you can usually tell because the roots go very grey and silvery if they need a water. If you do overwater them, again, you've got to be careful with transparent pots that you can get all this algae on the inside of the pot. The best way to get rid of that, or to stop it forming in the first place, is to put your pot inside another pot. So if you shield out the light, then you won't get algae. And I've done that over here with this Cattleya. So this Cattleya at one point did get a lot of algae inside it, so I put it inside another pot, and just the fact that it's dark is what's stopping that algae from forming. Same with this is a trunk full of water here. I know that it's going to get all sorts of algae in it if I let the light get to it, so I cover it over. Now of course what I don't want to leave out over here is that the more you get to know your plants, the more you get to know what conditions they're like and how much moisture they like, then the less chance that you've got of under or over watering. And I'm learning this all the time. For instance, this fern here. So this is, I can't remember what it's called, let's have a look. Pteris ensiformis fern. And this particular plant, I mean, and we know that a lot of ferns like to be kept moist. Phlebodium here is an exception to that. That grows epiphytically, usually in the same place that orchids do, and that actually doesn't mind being quite dry. But this Terrasensiformis, what this does, and it absolutely never stops drinking. It needs watering every day, and I can guarantee the following day it'll be dry no matter what the season. And what this does is, over at the top here of the fronds, it starts to go quite brown. So you can see in the past, and I've actually removed quite a lot of the fronds that have gone brown, but that's what this particular plant does. I've learnt that, so I'll make sure that I give it plenty of water. Now, having said that, what it doesn't like to do is it doesn't like to sit in water. So my little tip there is to put some stones at the bottom. So what happens is, I mean, you can put that in a tray, or you can just put it, I mean, I've got it in a bigger tray there, a gravel tray. Once the water goes through, it's not completely covering the bottom of the pot, so there are no roots that are still in the water once the water's drained away. So that's the usefulness of putting some gravel at the bottom there. And this brings me nicely to the overwatering. Now, for me anyway, in my environment, overwatering has been by far the biggest issue. And I think probably for many people who are enthusiastic and you feel like you want to be doing something to improve your plants, improve the rate of growth, you know, you feel like you want to nurture them, which is why we do it, overwatering can be a big problem. Maybe if you live in a very hot, dry country and you can't possibly overwater because you know that within an hour they're going to be baked by the sun, then that's not your issue. But certainly in in this kind of latitude where I am, in my kind of conditions in the UK, north of the UK, overwatering is my number one issue. So we've got a Masdevallia ignea here. Now I've got this in a clay pot, and I know that clay kind of leaches away the moisture from inside. In fact, you can even see the white there. That's the salts from watering and feeding. Actually, I don't feed it a lot, but there are salts in the water I use. I use rainwater with these things, so there's already dissolved things in there because it comes off the garage roof. I just water this around the edge, and this is one, because I know it doesn't mind being kept moist, I know that the clay pot's going to leach some of that away, going to draw some of that water away. I don't worry about that one. I water it whenever I feel like. It could be on a daily basis. I know it doesn't care, it doesn't mind, it's fine in this particular environment. I know that through experience. The Streptocarpus, I know will take quite a lot of water, but I also know that if the bottom bit of this pot is sitting in water, then they'll do exactly the same thing that they do when they're underwatered. In other words, they will flop. And that happens with a lot of pot plants. And at one point in time, now this is about 2 years old, this is an Oncidium sweet sugar. At one point in time, I had this in a pot this size, and it was a much smaller plant. This is a couple of years old, this one. And at the time I had no idea about the watering, and I overwatered it. Now the issue with having it in a big pot is that what you can see, I mean you can certainly see here, there's lots of moisture around the sides there, and that was watered about a week ago. I'm not even going to think of watering that until all that moisture is gone, because I know that this particular plant does not like lots of moisture around its roots, and it likes to dry out. So you've got to be careful. Has your plant been overpotted? Is it in too big a pot? And I've done the same problem with multiple plants until I finally learned my lesson. Orchids in particular prefer to be in smaller pots. They don't like a lot of moisture which is going to gather around the outside and keep that root, well, it's not really a root ball, keep those roots sopping wet. So first thing to do is to make sure it's in the right size pot. Once you know that it's kind of constricted inside the right size pot, then it's going to be easier to keep an eye on what the watering needs of it are. I've just recently repotted this, and just recently, because I know it's got a good set of roots on it, I've put it into a slightly bigger pot, and I've also put another pseudo bulb in there too, so there's an extra plant in there too. I'm hoping that's going to be okay and not too big for it, but I also know that I've got to be very, very careful of not watering it too much. I'll keep my eye on what's going on at the sides, and sometimes you get this condensation around the sides, but the bark in the middle of it is still dry, so that's something you've got to be careful of. So again, with these, if I can see that the leaves begin to shrivel a little bit, if the bulbs begin to shrivel, then I know of a problem. You can have another issue there, in that if you've rotted the roots off, no matter how much you water and water, you're not going to hydrate. And the thing that I did there was I put some sphagnum moss around just around the top where the roots would come from, so that when they do eventually come, as they usually do with orchids, then they'll have some moisture there straight away. And again, if that was the case, it needs putting in a much smaller pot, so you've not got that constant reservoir of wetness around it. Now over here we've got some carnivorous plants, and this one here is a Nepenthes ventricosa. Now, the reason I'm showing you these two plants is that these two like to be moist pretty much all the time. Now the problem here that we've got is that there is moss growing on the surface, and this is where my little test of feeling the surface of it can give you a false impression. There's not much weight in the pots anyway, so it's difficult to get to know what it feels like, you know, the weight of it, not what it sounds like. By touching the top is always moist because there's moss there. Moss holds onto the moisture. When I then go and get my moisture meter and dip it in, I then go and find that it's actually dry underneath. So this is where you've got to be careful. The moisture meter is a really good piece of kit. They're only cheap. I think mine was about £6.99, and there's no batteries in it. I'm not selling them or anything, it's just that it's a recently discovered piece of kit for me, and it really does seem to be making a difference. So to avoid underwatering Nepenthes, it's definitely worth checking to see, and you know, by all means have a feel at the top, but it could just be that it's just the top couple of centimeters that's dry, like it was with my bougainvillea, or it could be the opposite is true, as it is with these Nepenthes, that it's the top that's moist because of the moss, but underneath it's bone dry, so it needs a water. Okay, so I suppose the ultimate test for whether you've underwatered it or not is if you then go and water it again and it completely changes, you know, the state of the plant, it becomes turgid again, and the leaves pop up and the flowers look bright and rigid again, then you know that was the problem. These are dahlias. I can't lift them up. Well, I can lift them up, but because they're in a clay pots, they're terracotta coloured pots, they're too heavy to use that as a test to see whether they're wet or not. They've got gravel on the top, and the reason I put this kind of grit on top is because they're going to be outside, squirrels are going to be at them, and squirrels completely ignore any kind of pot when it's got grit on top. If it's just bare soil, they'll be in there, they'll be digging it up to put things in there. So easy to tell with dahlias because they do tend to flop over, but again, I can't have a feel of that, so that's going to be one for the moisture meter. Now, while I try to get all my orchids into transparent pots so I can see what's going on, when I buy them, very often they're not in transparent pots, and I've got two here. This one is a BLC Xingfeng Little Sun Youngming Golden Boy, I think. Yes, I kind of read most of that, I'm cheating a little bit. And on the back is just a no ID cattleya, and both of them are in non-transparent pots. Now that doesn't mean that they don't grow well, they can still grow really well in there, and I think if you have an environment where it's not really a problem, and maybe it's a humid environment, maybe you know they're going to dry out very quickly, that's not the issue, then by all means keep them in them pots. But for me, I need to see what's going on. You can see here I've put this one, this is an Epicattleya, I've put this one in a transparent pot. Now that one to me is getting close to needing a water. I can see some condensation on the inside of the pot, but I'm looking at the roots there and they're all looking a little bit green, so that tells me they're probably okay. But once they go a little bit more silvery, then I'm going to give that a water. But this one, this is where we do the lip test. Now sometimes you can avoid doing the lip test just by simply taking it out, holding it up to the sun, and if you can see a little bit of glistening in the sun, then you know that it's probably wet. Now I'm just looking at this one now. I know you won't be able to see this. Not quite sure, I can't see any glistening, so I would hold it up to my lip, and yeah, that one's dry. That's ready for a water. Now I know some people might not want to do that, because it does mean putting something that's been in some soil or been in some media up to your lip. Why do we put it to our lip? Well, lips are really sensitive when it comes to detecting moisture, and I've found that when I can't tell at all, just by simply doing this with this lip test with the label, it really does work for me, and it tells me whether there's some moisture in there. If there's any moisture at all, especially with something like a cattleya that doesn't like to be soaking wet, then I know that it's not ready for a water yet. And this is where it comes down to really knowing your plants. If I just move over to this prayer plant here, now this one, when this was in the house, I definitely overwatered it to death, and it just, well, not quite to death as you can see, but it really set it back for a good 12 months, and I ended up cutting them in half. I've got two now. I've got that one, and I've got another one over there. And it's this, if anybody's ever had one of these, they're very hairy, and it traps the moisture. Now over here I've got a fogger, and a fogger really ups the humidity in this side of the greenhouse. So this one I water about once every 6 weeks. I give it a tiny little bit, and even now if I feel it, it's still moist from the last time I watered it. I can't even remember when it was. It's weeks and weeks ago. It gets most of its moisture from the air. It traps it in the hairs and it takes it in that way. It does not like lots of water. You can very, very easily overwater it. Now if you've got one of these plant pots, I'll see if I've got one. I'm not sure if I actually have. Oh yes, I have. If you've got one of these nice ornamental plant pots with no holes in the bottom, if you've bought it and it's already, like, the plant is planted in there, it's not in another pot, it's planted straight into there, then you've two options. One option is to say to yourself, right, I'm just going to throw this away when I eventually overwater it to death, because that's likely what you will do. Unless that water can drain away, if you can't put holes in the bottom, which clearly in this case you can't, then water is going to gather at the bottom there. You can try to not give it quite enough water, but is it going to thrive? I very much doubt it. And I think this is where this ice cube movement came from for Phalaenopsis. I know I've not seen them much over in the UK. I think they are over in the UK, but what happens is here, and I'm sure lots of you've heard about this, where you get a Phalaenopsis, you buy one, and they tell you just simply add an ice cube to the top of the media and leave it like that. Now I've known people who's kept an orchid like that for months, and it's worked. Even though it's not ideal, they don't get that in the wild. They come from tropical areas, the last thing they get is any ice in the wild. But if it works, it works. I'm not recommending it, but it's clearly worked for people that I've spoken to. I wouldn't have thought, I've not tried it, this is me just kind of guessing here, I wouldn't have thought that long term it will be doing the plant much good. I would think, yeah, it might flower, but whether you'll get it to rebloom by using an ice cube, I don't know. But I think the reason they do that is A, because they know people are short on time, or some people are short on time and they don't want to spend time putting it over the sink and letting it drain through. But B, I think they are hoping that people will then go and buy another one when eventually it dies. I can add a C to that by putting an ice cube on, you're not actually giving it much water, so the water is likely to have, any that isn't used up is likely to have evaporated before it starts to build up in the bottom of your pot, which doesn't have any drainage holes in it. So if it was me, the first thing I would do is remove it and replant it, but I know not all people can do that. So, you know, if you're quite happy to throw these things away, then by all means give it an ice cube, or even just give it a tiny bit of water. But I expect over time you will build water up in the bottom of your pot, and eventually you will just simply rot the roots or drown it, or have the roots submerged in water, which it won't like. Okay, so I have some thoughts on watering mounts as well. Now, it's only really when you start diving into watering that you realise how actually it's really complicated. There's so many factors to take into account. I think there might be people sitting at home thinking, well, all I do is I go with a hose pipe and I spray the lot and that's done. Well, the chances are that what you're doing there is you are growing plants which are specifically adapted to your particular environment. If you've got the environment that those plants are used to growing in and like to grow in, maybe that's where they originate from, or maybe they originate from a place that's very similar. And I'm talking in terms of the water requirements, the humidity, the light requirements, the day length, the temperature, all these things that are taken into account. Whereas where I am in the north of the UK, I'm growing plants in one greenhouse, and they're all very different, and they come from very different places to the UK. They don't originate here, and I'm trying to create an artificial environment really. And these plants, you cannot just take watering in and of itself. You can't look at it and say, right, well, this is a tip, or this is a hack for watering, and that we can apply that to every single plant. It's very difficult to do that. You've got to look at your individual plants. So that would be really the first thing to think of. The other things that I talked about are pretty general, and they're really almost assuming that you already have looked at the requirements of your plants and you know what it is that they want. Once that's taken for granted and that's taken into account, then these tips should help. So obviously if you've got something like a Vanda like that, and it is bare rooted and all its water has got to be from whatever you supply it, then a fogger or a humidifier of some sort is going to be really beneficial. I keep it in here to about 80%, but at the moment, because I've got vents open, it's really struggling to do that. At the moment it's on at about, where are we now? It's at 66%, and it's dropping very rapidly. You might just be able to see it there amongst all the Streptocarpus. I've just turned it off because, like literally a couple of minutes ago, because of the noise, and it's dropping very quickly. So once all the vents open, because I've only got one vent open there, I've got 3 louvre windows and another vent. Once they're all open, because I won't be able to keep the temperature down enough, then all that humidity will go. Then I'm going to end up watering even more. So the mounts that I've got here, now this Phalaenopsis, the original mount, it didn't have all this moss on it. It had moss underneath, and the roots were on top of that. Now I found that in my environment that was just too dry. Even though it's very humid around here, it just couldn't get the moisture that it wanted. So I've tried it with some moss on top of it as well, and it seems to be working because we've got some new growth there in quite a short length of time. I've done pretty much the same with all of these now. I've kind of cocooned them up almost like one of these kokedama things, so that the roots have something to go into. You've got to be careful with moss on mounts, in as much as it can appear that they are either wet on the surface when in actual fact they're dry underneath, and vice versa, where they can appear like it's dry on top, but when you dig into it, it's wet underneath. So that's something else to watch out for. Now if you started off with a very small pot and you've not potted it up, so like for example this Streptocarpus here is in an 8cm pot, but I've got all this growth on it. This is red jewel, and this is now getting to the point where every 2 days it's like absolutely bone dry. So rather than just keep watering it, that's going to have to be potted up. I might leave it a bit longer just to kind of restrict it, but I'm not really helping it to thrive by doing that. I've got my Miltoniopsis over here in a shady spot, not too far from the fogger. It's still fairly bright, And if anybody's interested, that Metonopsis has begun to put some new growth on it. I don't know whether it's got any roots on it yet, but there are some new growths coming from the pseudo bulb, so that isn't dead yet. I'll not give up on it just yet. Okay, so that's just a few little tips on overwatering and underwatering your plants, whether it be an orchid, an ornamental style pot, or a transparent pot, or a plant in a multi-purpose compost or in peat. And I think there's probably one more thing I need to mention before I go, and that's anything that's like a bog plant. Here we've got some Venus flytraps have been recently repotted, and they go in some water that I put in the bottom of the tray. Now, one thing to note about that, pretty much whatever pot you put them in, eventually, because at the moment I just put water in the tray at the bottom there and they suck it up from beneath, but eventually the soil or the compost that's in there starts to come out at the bottom of the pot, and you end up with it all in the tray and not in the pot. So that's just something to bear in mind, and I don't really think there's a way around that unless you've got it planted in the ground. So that's something to think about when you're watering those kind of bog plants. So that's it for now. So if you've got any hints and tips that you can think of that I've not mentioned that maybe would suit my environment or your environment better, I'd love to hear from you. Put it in the comments, and for now that's it, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.